Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy McVie. I'm the CEO of QCOS, and on behalf of QCOS and our peak partners, Community Legal Centres Queensland, Ending Violence Against Women Queensland, Peak Care Queensland, Queensland Alliance for Mental Health, Queensland Families and Communities Association, Queensland Youth Housing Coalition, Q Shelter, Tenants Queensland, Volunteering Queensland, and the Youth Affairs Network of Queensland. I'd really warmly like to welcome you to this morning's webinar, Vaccine Mandates for the Community Services Sector. And we're so thrilled to have three lawyers from Clayton Utz joining us today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Turrbal and the Yagara people this morning, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, as well as pay my deep respects to all First Nations people joining us online today, and to the owners of all of the lands across our state, as I know that we've got members from all over the state joining us today. We have in excess of 500 people registered for this morning's webinar, and I think this really indicates how much concern there is in our sector, and that sector really relates to primarily, I think, making sure the people in our community that we all get out of bed every morning to serve are as well protected as possible and able to use our essential services. Also, people are really concerned about the health and safety of their workforce, and we're hearing strongly as well real concerns about organisations wanting to live by their values and respect the human rights of both service users and organisations. So because of this really significant concern, we have put this morning's webinar on together with our peak partners. And we have also published a resource which has been authored by Clayton Utz and made it available on our website. It's a fantastic resource to help community organisations guide decision making around how they should manage their individual risk for their individual organisation. And I'm emphasising that point because the resource is general in nature and absolutely doesn't replace getting individual advice or doing your own risk assessment based on the circumstances of the organisation you run. So I'd just like to really take the opportunity to deeply thank our speakers this morning from Clayton Utz, both for their time this morning and for the resource they've prepared in support of the session this morning. So by way of introduction, our speakers this morning are Christy Miller, who is a partner from Clayton Utz. Christy specialises in industrial relations, employment, discrimination and work, health and safety law, and is highly regarded for her ability to provide plain-speaking legal and strategic advice to a wide portfolio of public and private sector lawyers. Christy has an in-depth knowledge of the federal and Queensland industrial relations schemes and aims to provide strategic advice to clients, taking into consideration their particular needs and balancing business and regulatory imperatives. We also have joining us Tim Gordon, Special Counsel at Clayton Utz. Tim is Special Counsel in the public sector team. He specialises in regulatory advisory services, statutory interpretation, administrative law, government procurement and contracting and outsourcing arrangements. And we also have Nicola Skeggs, a lawyer from Clayton Utz, joining us. She specialises in workplace relations, employment and safety. So thank you, Christy, Nicola and Tim. We're so grateful to have you here today. We are going to run the session this morning till 11. I'm going to hand over to Christy, Nicola and Tim in a second, and they're going to talk for about 25 minutes. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So thanks to everyone who have provided your questions. I must say we've been absolutely inundated with questions, and I'm going to say up front that we're not going to get to all of them this morning, but we will have a chance to ask some of the really important questions that you have posed. So I might now hand over to Clayton Utz to give their presentation.
Great. Thank you, Amy. We're just going to get our slides up on the screen, but as we do, I'd like to say a big good morning to everyone. We're really pleased that we could be here today and support QCOS in this. We've been giving a lot of advice to our clients and the community in relation to mandating the vaccine. The question on everyone's lips seems to be at the moment to mandate or not to mandate. What we want to do is give you some tools to help you for your own organisations answer those questions, because while you may all end up in the same or a similar place at the end of the day, how you get there is very much dependent upon your own organisation and the risk profile of that organisation. As Amy said, one of the most important features, and I can't stress highly enough, is that each organisation needs to undertake their own risk assessment. And we'll run through some of the questions as part of that process that you need to be asking yourself. So in terms of the topics that we're going to talk about today, and I promise not to hog all the limelight, I won't do all of the talking, but I may do the bulk of the talking because I do like to talk. But I am going to address your obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act. Nicola is going to talk about the government directions mandating vaccines in the workplace. And I do know that we've had an announcement from the Queensland government this morning in relation to some further mandates. We'll concentrate on the mandates that are already in place, but we will mention those as well. Then I'm going to come back to the question of issuing a reasonable and lawful direction, because there are three considerations that we need to have there. We need to understand our safety obligations. We need to understand if a mandate from the government impacts our organisation. And if it doesn't, we then need to ask ourselves, is it a lawful and reasonable directions to mandate the vaccine in our workplace? There are obviously some human rights implications for that as well. So I'll hand over to Tim, who's going to take us through those and answer our questions in that respect. So moving on. Mandatory COVID vaccine policies are what we are seeing becoming increasingly common in Australia. And this is because of the heightened risk of transmission that was posed by the Delta strain. And now also we have another strain that we're dealing with. We have a lot of very concerned organisations and individuals in our community who are waiting for that date of the 17th of December when the Queensland government has indicated that the borders might open and we may be subjected to increasing local transmission of COVID. While there are various public health orders already in place in Queensland and certainly across Australia, which will have the effect of mandating for some employers the requirement to require workers, including volunteers, to get the vaccination, this is not clear for all employers. And determining whether vaccines should be mandated in any particular workplace, we must first consider, is that policy or is that government mandate in place? What are our safety obligations? And then if there is no public health order in place, we need to consider whether it is a reasonable and lawful direction in all of the circumstances. So these are the matters that you need to consider, and I think that they should be really considered in this order. We need to understand what our work health and safety obligations are, then the mandates, then this question of what is a reasonable and lawful direction. And there are some interesting cases in the reasonable and lawful direction space, particularly related to the flu vaccine, but that can be used in this particular area. The Fair Work Ombudsman, as one of the regulators in the employment space, has also released some guidance as to when it might be appropriate or reasonable to issue that direction. And then I know it's important that we consider the risks of mandating and conversely, the risks of not mandating that vaccination. So let's turn very quickly to the work health and safety obligations, just so we're all on the same page and we understand what our obligations are as businesses. So under Australia's model work health and safety legislation, each state and territory has its own work health and safety laws, and it requires a person conducting a business or undertaking, so that is the organisation itself, to enforce their primary duty or to ensure, as far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers who are engaged by the organisation, workers whose activities are influenced or directed by others within the organisation, and other persons. So that's a very broad and expansive definition requiring each organisation to, as far as is reasonably practicable, and they're very important words, ensure the health and safety of all workers in your organisation, so that's your volunteers as well, they are also workers, and all service users who come into your organisation. So what is this concept of reasonably practicable? And when we're thinking of what is reasonably practicable to carry out to ensure health and safety, what do we need to look at? I've got a little note up there on the screen, and this is set out in the paper that we have provided to QPOS as well. But things that you need to take into account include the likelihood of the hazard or risk occurring, the degree of harm that might result, ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, because there may not just be one, there may be others, and whether the cost of eliminating or minimising the risk is grossly disproportionate to the risk. Now, cost is, and you'll see obviously we've included it there in that list, the cost of implementing a health and safety measure is a relevant consideration to take into account when considering is it practicable to take that step, but it is only one consideration. And the likelihood of the risk occurring and the impact of that risk, I think in some respects must be weighed against the cost associated with implementing a risk minimisation strategy. So that is your health and safety obligation. And what each organisation needs to do is to carry out a risk assessment to understand and to ask themselves those questions as against and as they are relevant for your own organisations to understand what is the risk profile. The higher the risk profile of your organisation, the more likely it is that you need to take more measures to try and guard against the impact of the risk in question, which is the risk of the COVID-19 being transmitted in your business. Then it comes to the question of, are you required to mandate the vaccination? If you've done your risk assessment and it says there is a high risk of transmission, you have a lot of service users coming into your premises, you don't know where from the community those service users are coming from, you have a small work environment with many staff or people in the environment at the same time, I think that demonstrates there is a potentially high risk of transmission within your organisation. The question we then mostly get asked is, if in those circumstances, are we required to mandate the vaccination? And I think it's important to keep in mind that the guide to the Work Health and Safety Act, as set out by Safe Work Australia, expressly states that there is currently no requirement under the Work Health and Safety Act to mandate vaccinations, and that vaccinations are only one measure that can be used to reduce the risk of COVID in the workplace. So I think that's really important to keep in mind because a lot of organisations are asking us, we do have a high risk, but do we have to? And the short answer to that is no, you don't have to mandate the vaccine. This is putting aside the question of whether a government mandate applies to you. In those circumstances, the answer will be yes, and we'll come back to Nicola in that question in a minute. But if there is no government mandate, you've done your risk assessment, the risk might be high, but you've got to look at other means available. Vaccines are just one control measure and by themselves may not be effective to appropriately control or manage the risk. So you can look at other measures and have a think about measures that have been used, I'm sure by all of your organisations throughout the last 2 years that may have been effective and may continue to be effective. Social distancing within the workplace, managing the amount of people who are in the workplace at any one time, including partitions if that's appropriate in a retail or other service office environment. The use of face masks. These are all control measures that have been used successfully over the last 2 years to stem the spread of COVID-19. So on the one hand, we've got the guide that says we do not have to mandate and that vaccines are only one control measure. That is also just a guide. It is not a definitive source of obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act. However, it is very instructive for us and reflective of the position that the Office of Industrial Relations, I think, will take with respect to mandatory vaccinations. But that doesn't answer the question of can you or should you mandate the vaccinations for your workplace? How we answer that question depends on how we have considered our work health and safety obligations and what the outcome of that risk assessment is. The answer may be that you can. And I think for many organisations, the answer to can I mandate the vaccine, understanding what our work health and safety obligations are, and understanding that it is one control measure that is readily available to most of the public, that it would be considered a reasonably practicable measure to implement to guard against and protect the health and safety, not just of our workers, including our volunteers, but also of our service users, that mandating the vaccine represents an effective and appropriate control measure, particularly as our state moves towards opening borders, and inevitably, I think, as we see community transmission in Queensland increase. But this needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis, particularly where employees and volunteers have limited contact with service users and the organisation can or will continue to implement other means of protecting staff. It is certainly open to organisations to decide not to implement mandatory vaccinations. So now we've looked at, very briefly, the work health and safety obligations, those general obligations that apply to all organisations. And we've looked at how that interacts with the requirement or otherwise to mandate the vaccine. We've seen from the Safe Work Australia guide that it's not required, but we've also seen that we can answer that question of can and should you mandate potentially differently to the question of are we required to mandate. Now, Nicola, I'm going to hand over to you to touch on the government mandates and what this means for organisations.
So we've set out in the paper for you in Schedule 1 the current government mandates. You'll see the Queensland one has been broken down into what's current now, as well as what's coming into effect from the 17th of December, or when 80% of Queenslanders are vaccinated, whichever is the earliest. Obviously, there's a new one that's come out today that we haven't considered in the schedule, but it looks to us as though the first dose is required on the 17th of December and second dose is in the beginning of January before school starts. The public health orders haven't been released for these yet. In terms of the public health orders, organisations will need to consider whether they fall into one of the categories requiring your employees and volunteers to be vaccinated. If you do, your organisation is under a legal obligation to ensure the mandatory vaccination of your employees and your volunteers, and you'll need to implement this into your organisation. You should also consider whether your service users are caught by the mandatory vaccination requirements if they enter into your organisation's premises, or if they meet an employee or volunteer somewhere that is also caught by the mandatory vaccination requirements. If that's the case, you'll also need to make sure that you take all reasonable steps to comply with those vaccination requirements. In terms of the public health orders, we have seen a number of challenges to them in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland. So far, all of those have been unsuccessful. So as organisations, you can be comfortable in embedding the vaccination requirements into policy where the government mandate exists to do so. We know that a number of you are in the disability or healthcare space and have had questions about the application of the healthcare direction. The direction itself, when you go to it, provides definitions. We've set out on the slide the definition for a worker in healthcare. As you can see, some parts of the direction are quite specific, such as those persons registered under APRA. However, some of them are very broad, such as the final one in D, which captures any other person who works in a healthcare setting. Now, D does also come with some examples, which we've again set out on this slide for you. But it's important to note that the examples are not exhaustive, and simply because your organisation doesn't meet one of those examples doesn't mean that they won't be caught by the definition.
Thanks, Nicola. And as Nicola mentioned, there has been some new announcements from the government this morning about new mandates that will come into place for the education sector, for childcare, for all teachers in the education sector and people entering schools. I think it's also important to keep in mind when we think about mandates that the mandate that will come into effect from the Queensland government on the 17th of December, the public health order in Queensland hasn't been released. We do not have the details associated with that. It'll be important to keep checking the Queensland Health and Government website in relation to COVID to see if and when they release that in advance of the 17th of December. So we've looked at your health and safety obligations, that general obligation to protect the health and safety of everyone in the workplace. We've considered the application of the existing healthcare workers mandate. You would have also seen by now a number of companies across Australia have, in advance of any mandates being released by state governments, acted to implement mandatory vaccination policies outside the healthcare sector as well. We are seeing employers taking a very robust approach in relation to mandating vaccines. SPC, for example, was one of the first organisations to do so, a fruit and vegetable processor. They were the first company to mandate vaccines for all on-site staff and visitors. And its chief executive officer noted that as a food processor, they have an obligation not only to protect its staff, but also to protect the food supply for the country. Now, they received some significant backlash from unions, but who ultimately tried to challenge the legitimacy of their mandatory vaccination policy, but that was ultimately unsuccessful. And in Victoria, WorkSafe Victoria gave them the go-ahead for implementation and ensured that, and basically said that they had complied with all of their consultation obligations. We've seen Qantas and Virgin implement similar policies in their organisations. BHP is the most recent large organisation to look at mandating vaccinations for its workforce. That matter is currently pending before a full Fair Work Commission full bench, and we are waiting with bated breath for that decision, which I think will again provide some guidance for smaller organisations as to the stance that they can take in their own organisations to mandate or not mandate the vaccine. But it looks like overall that employers are receiving a very favourable hearing from the Fair Work Commission and other regulatory bodies when it is when they are considering mandating the vaccine in their workplace. So once we've answered the question of the safety obligations, we've seen what those broad safety obligations are. We've considered whether a government mandate applies to us. In the absence of that government mandate, then, the key question for employers looking to mandate vaccines is to consider whether such a mandate would be considered a reasonable and lawful direction, taking into account all the circumstances and the nature of employment or the volunteer work being undertaken. And I keep mentioning volunteers there. I don't think there is any need or requirement to treat the volunteers any differently from your employees. And the obligations that you owe to volunteers are the same as those that you owe to your employees as well. This question of reasonableness, what is a reasonable and lawful direction, is determined on a sliding scale by reference to risk assessments of the workplace in question. So that same risk assessment that you carried out or will carry out in relation to assessing what your work health and safety obligations are will be of great value to you in then assessing whether it is reasonable and lawful for you to implement a mandatory vaccination policy in your workplace. If the risk assessment has indicated that the risk of COVID transmission in your workplace and in your community is high, it is likely that it will be considered a reasonable and lawful direction then for you to implement a mandatory policy of vaccination, which will help you overcome and meet that risk of COVID transmission. But it's important to keep in mind that even if you proceed with implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, and even though I have said that employers are getting a very favourable viewing from the Fair Work Commission, a lot of the cases we're seeing to date are in relation to consultation obligations, which I'll briefly touch on, but which exist probably under your enterprise agreements if they apply to you, but also under the Work Health and Safety Act. But this is not a risk-free area in implementing mandatory vaccination policies. And what you need to do is make sure that you are in a position to continually reassess the requirements for mandatory vaccination, because that risk profile for your organisation, both when considering it from a work health and safety perspective and whether it's a reasonable and lawful direction, will continue to change. I think the circumstances that organisations are faced with now are different to those that will be faced with after borders open on the 17th of December. And we need to be either doing the risk profiling or assessment now in anticipation of that 17 December date or when those borders open, and understanding where those differences lie. But in trying to understand that risk profile and how the Commission will interpret a mandatory vaccination policy, we can take some guidance from some cases in the Commission relating to flu vaccinations and the mandating of flu vaccines, particularly in the aged care and childcare space. Nicola, can you take us through those cases?
So I'm going to talk to you about two cases that we've had recently in the Fair Work Commission. The first is the matter of Kimber. Kimber was an aged care employee who refused to obtain the influenza vaccination. In this case, it's important to note that there was a public health order in New South Wales which required persons who worked within or otherwise attended New South Wales residential aged care facilities to be vaccinated for the flu. In the decision, the Fair Work Commission found that it was not only lawful because it effectively reflected what in fact was law as it applied in 2020 concerning employees working within New South Wales residential aged care facilities, but they also found that it was reasonable as the employer acted in an objectively prudent and reasonable way in not permitting the applicant to work absent an up-to-date flu shot. The decision was appealed and the full bench of the Fair Work Commission upheld the decision. However, the matter has been flagged for appeal to the Federal Court. So following that, we also had the Glover and Ozcare decision. Again, this is another refusal of the influenza vaccine, and it was held that the direction was lawful and reasonable. This one, the Commissioner gave us some details of the consideration she had when she found that the direction was reasonable. And importantly, for those people on the line today, is that one of those considerations was the vulnerable nature of the aged care clients that they looked after.
Thanks, Nicola. So, applying the reasons from those cases and the different considerations, what we understand is that the Commission, when assessing whether a mandatory vaccination policy is reasonable and lawful, they'll look at the nature of the workforce. They'll look at the vulnerable service users who will be required to or need to utilise your services. They'll look at the makeup of your workforce as well. They'll look at whether any public health orders apply, but that alone won't be a definitive factor. I've set out on the screen there some factors that may weigh in favour of maybe reasonable and lawful direction to implement a mandatory vaccination, and some that may not be. Certainly where there is limited or no risk of transmission and where the employees or the volunteers are capable from working remotely, or there is a capacity to socially distance and to properly protect the workforce by other means, then it may be less reasonable. But again, I want to stress that this needs to be considered on a rolling basis. This is not a set and forget. We can't implement a mandatory vaccination policy now and not then reassess in the coming months and into next year whether it continues to be reasonable or appropriate. Or we may make a decision now not to implement a mandatory vaccination policy and wait to consider and see the impact of community transmission in Queensland after the borders open. I've set out on the slide some additional factors that will be considered reasonable by the Commission when we're considering implementing these mandatory vaccination policies, and including where the business is considered an essential service which is required to operate during periods of lockdown, such as supermarkets were in that category, and whether you consider that your business or the organisation and the support services that your organisation provides fits within that category. That may increase the reasonableness of mandating the vaccine for your workers, including your volunteers, so that you can continue to deliver on that service. So we've looked at our work health and safety obligations. We've assessed what they are, and as I've said, we've undertaken hopefully a risk assessment to fully understand the risk of COVID transmission in our workplace. We've had a look at the Queensland government mandates and whether they apply. That may take the decision out of our hands and may require you to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. If not, we've then gone to that extra step to consider, would it be considered a reasonable and lawful direction for you to mandate the policy? I did want to touch on as well the risks of introducing a mandatory vaccination policy, because as I said earlier, this is not a matter that is without risk. And I do understand there is a lot of concern amongst organisations, I'm seeing it amongst my clients as well, about the impact on their staff of implementing such a mandatory vaccination policy. There is the risk of workers' compensation claims. We are already seeing these come through, and the potential risk of injury being suffered by an individual in circumstances where they are required by an employer to get the vaccination. By the same token, this risk works on both sides of the fence. It is a risk for implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, but it is also a risk that organisations are facing when they do not implement such a policy, because the risk of COVID spreading in those workplaces is higher. And we are already seeing organisations subject to workers' compensation claims where employees have contracted COVID in the workplace. So that's something to keep in mind on both sides of the fence. Also, the federal government is implementing a no-fault liability scheme to address serious injury and illness arising from obtaining the vaccination, and that's something to keep in mind as well. Other risks arising from implementing a mandatory vaccination policy include non-compliance and having to manage that non-compliance with the policy in your workplace. Challenges to the legality of the policy. We are seeing many challenges to the state government mandates, particularly in the southern states, but also in Queensland. None, as Nicola mentioned, none have yet been successful. Unfair dismissal claims. A consequence of not complying with a mandatory vaccination policy will inevitably be that you may need to consider moving to termination of employment for some of your staff. This will or may result in unfair dismissal claims or discrimination complaints or potentially general protection claims. They will need to be dealt with. If we have undertaken, however, the steps along the way, we've done our work health and safety risk assessment, we've looked at whether it's a reasonable and lawful direction, and then we've decided to implement. And we've taken into account any medical contraindication certificates that might be supplied. So those individuals who inform us that they have a disability or an illness that prevents them from getting the vaccination, then putting those matters aside, I'm not sure that there would be a successful unfair dismissal or discrimination risk that you would be facing in those circumstances. And otherwise, media or reputational damage arising for the organisation and potentially union intervention. Certainly that's what we're seeing in the BHP matter at the moment, who have taken the matter to the Fair Work Commission with the decision pending. So once we get through all the risks and once we've understand all of our obligations and we've decided to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, there are some remaining obligations that it will be important to continue to consider as you draft that policy and implement it in your workplace. There are obviously consultation obligations. Now, your organisation may have its own enterprise agreement in place that will have clauses in it dealing with consultation in the event of major workplace change. I think you should, if you are introducing a policy of this nature, comply with those obligations and consider that this policy may give rise to a workplace change subject to how your clause is drafted. You'll also have consultation obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act in any event that you will need to comply with. I always say consult early and consult often. Survey the workforce. Try and understand what the level of vaccination rate currently is in the workplace. Understand what sentiment might be in the workplace to mandatory vaccination and any concerns that workers have in relation to implementing a mandatory vaccination policy or not implementing a mandatory vaccination policy, and rely upon the outcomes of that survey or that consultative material to provide to your workplace a draft policy or the preliminary decision to move towards mandatory vaccination and seek further comment and feedback on that. Certainly, your obligations in this regard are reduced if you are required to implement such a policy as a result of the government mandates that we've spoken about. Privacy issues also exist around collecting and storing health information. And you need to consider for your organisation whether the Privacy Act will apply to you, and if so, how you comply with those obligations in relation to collection and storage of this information. And I've also mentioned the managing of those medical exemptions and potential discrimination claims. We are seeing a lot of different medical contraindication certificates being provided to employers down south at the moment, and they are granting full exemptions, so permanent exemptions from getting the mandatory vaccination along the lines of an illness or an allergy as such to the vaccine ingredients, or temporary vaccination contraindication certificates as well that provide a temporary exemption from obtaining the vaccination that need to be renewed every 6 months. And they can be for other acute illnesses or concerns that may be impacting the individual at that point in time. Those should be considered, and any policy that you draft should take into consideration and include a plan for how you will manage that medical exemption process. A final issue to consider is in relation to the Human Rights Act. And I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to take us through this.
As we all know, from including from the QCOS Human Rights seminar series, the Human Rights Act in Queensland commenced 1 January 2020. For public entities, essentially imposes 2 key obligations. First, a substantive obligation to make acts or decisions that are compatible with human rights. It also imposes a procedural obligation to make sure that you're giving proper consideration to human rights when you're making your decisions. The thing to keep in mind is the Human Rights Act applies in this regard to public entities. So you've got to analyse, is your entity a public entity that's subject to the Human Rights Act? It's clear that what we'd call traditional government entities like government departments or local governments, they're clearly public entities. It also extends to entities that carry out functions of a public nature for the state, entities that might be fully funded by the state and receive funding under funding agreements from the state to carry out public functions will also be public entities. We've gone through the list of entities attending today's webinar, and we know that a number of you are public entities for this purpose, so you'll have obligations under the Human Rights Act. So what does it mean in terms of in the context of mandating vaccines for your workplace? Well, it's clear that mandating vaccines does have the potential to limit some of the human rights that are provided for in the Human Rights Act. The obvious rights that are impacted are the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief, the right to privacy, the right not to be subjected to medical treatment without consent, the right to equality. There have already been a number of cases in Victoria, which is another jurisdiction which has a similar human rights piece of legislation, a number of cases in Victoria and in Queensland where mandating vaccine for the workplace and for service users has been challenged in the courts on human rights grounds. Those cases haven't been decided yet, so we'll see whether other human rights arguments stack up. But that aside, whilst human rights can be limited by mandating vaccines, it's also clear that it can be, that doesn't make a decision or an act unlawful. Where the Human Rights Act is concerned, the question that's always considered is a limitation on human rights reasonable and proportionate. In determining whether mandating vaccines for your workplace is reasonable and proportionate, a number of factors have to be considered. First of all, you consider how severe the limitation is on the relevant human right. How much does it impact on the right to privacy or freedom of thought, for example? Then at the same time, you have to balance the rights of others, the right to life of others, the right to well-being of others. That's, in terms of others, we're talking about other employees, other service users, their right to be protected from the COVID-19 vaccine. So after going through that process, considering all of the relevant rights, it's then a balancing exercise to weigh up, is the limitation on the right justified in the circumstances? These human rights considerations, I think, are only going to be fairly limited if Queensland goes down the route of having a broad public health order. As we've seen from what Nicola and Christy have already analysed, there are a number of public health orders which are in place. Where a public health order is in place, which requires you to have a workplace that's vaccinated to provide particular services, there's not going to be any issue about complying with the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act recognises that if you comply with a lawful obligation or a statutory requirement, you can't be in breach of the Human Rights Act. It's going to be more in the situation where you're working in a sector that's not subject to one of the public health orders that the human rights considerations are potentially going to be relevant. So overall, human rights are certainly at the bottom and at the base of all of the public health orders. The government, we know, whenever they're making the public health orders, has to go through that process under the Human Rights Act of analysing whether a public health order is compatible with human rights. But in terms of actually applying the Human Rights Act, essentially it's going to be applying similar rationale and similar reasoning to what you have to do when you're ascertaining whether mandating a vaccine is a lawful and reasonable direction, including considering your work health and safety obligations, including evaluating what the risk is at particular times, noting that that risk can change.
Thanks, Tim. So you've got those 3 steps. You're looking at your work health and safety obligations. You're considering the risk assessment there. You're considering whether the public health order applies. You're considering, if it doesn't, whether it's a reasonable and lawful direction. And the same, as Tim's right, the same considerations as a reasonable and lawful direction in the employment space will be relevant and applicable when you're considering it from a human rights angle as well. The last thing I wanted to mention before we go to some questions is the potential of alternative measures to mandating the vaccine. Incentives, we've seen, can be a very useful tool in encouraging employees and volunteers to increase vaccine take-up. And we just got up on the slide some examples. Now, the TGA have released some guidance and some notes as to what can be included as an incentive to individuals for vaccine take-up, and there's some strict rules around how you advertise and how you encourage employees or volunteers in that respect. So if you're going down that path, and if your policy is not going to be a mandatory vax policy, but you're going to have an incentivization scheme, you need to have a look at that TGA website and some information that they have there. You cannot incentivize individuals with tobacco or alcohol. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, but it is an alternative. So just wrapping up before we get to the questions, it's been quite a windy road that we have taken you on, and we've addressed each of these considerations, but I just did want to note again that consider your work health and safety obligations. They are requirements mandated under the legislation, and there are penalties that apply for not addressing those. So make sure you've done your risk assessment. And if the risk assessment says that you do not have to mandate or it's not a requirement, particularly bearing in mind that guidance from Safe Work Australia, make sure that that's clear in the documentation so you have a good paper trail of the considerations that you have undertaken. Then look at the government mandates. Then consider whether, in the absence of a mandate, whether it's a reasonable and lawful direction. Consider the human rights implications of that, and make sure you conduct an ongoing risk assessment as and when circumstances change. That brings us to the end of that windy road. Thanks, Amy. I might hand back to you for some questions.
Thanks so much, Christy. That was fantastic, and actually did really address a lot of the questions that we've had coming in over the past couple of weeks. I think really the key thing that I took away from that, and I hate to break it down to one sort of sentence, but what is absolutely a non-negotiable is that organisations should be doing their own risk assessment, and then they should be, based on that risk assessment, looking at what are the things that need to be put in place to manage that risk. And mandating vaccinations is one possible option that organisations may take depending on their own circumstances. And the other thing is that we can't set and forget. So it's an ongoing process of assessing risk and depending on changing circumstances, to make sure that we've got the right level of risk management in place. So the first question I've got here is from a very small organisation, and it's something, Christy, that you have already touched on. but this organisation is very concerned about the legal implications, including the requirement to pay compensation if one of their staff, if they do mandate and then one of their staff members has an adverse reaction to the vaccination. Now, I know you already touched on the federal government's consideration of the no-fault COVID-19 indemnity scheme, but wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what that means and also what are the implications in the meantime.
Might hand over to Nicola for this one.
Thank you. So there is a potential that an employee will be able to make a workers' compensation claim where they receive an adverse reaction, where they an employee mandate requiring them to be vaccinated. However, like Christy said, there is the Commonwealth Government scheme that's being set up. It covers costs of injuries for claims between $5,000 and $20,000, and the evidence requirements are still currently being developed for claims over $20,000 up to including death. So employers can point their employees or volunteers to that scheme. However, it's not going to remove their risk in its entirety. But like Christy said earlier as well, you do need to balance that against the risk of if they catch COVID-19 in the workplace, we are seeing workers' compensation claims being accepted for the transmission of COVID in the workplace as well.
And it's really hard to predict the impact of COVID on an individual person. We're seeing some very mild symptoms associated with it, and then we are seeing significant injury or illness requiring hospitalisation for long periods of time. So this one is a real balancing exercise, and I'm really sorry that we don't have, a really easy answer for this particular question. It is one of the, I think, tough complexities of the decision to mandate or not mandate the vaccination. But I think the risk weighs equally on each side of the fence. So whether an employer is going to be liable to an employee if they mandate, I think that's equally balanced, on the other hand, by the liability that arises if they don't mandate. So if that's a consideration, I think that maybe should be taken out of the mix for organisations, and to focus on the risk assessment and what other steps, if they're not going to mandate, what other steps can be put in place to try and meet that safety obligation to employees.
Thank you. And I guess that also goes to any other type of measurement that you might put in place to keep your staff and service users safe. It might be mandating vaccinations. It may be mandating other things as well, like the use of PPE.
Definitely.
So you did touch on this next question as well. I think organisations, obviously, you talked about the requirement to, if we're considering a mandate that is a significant change to the workplace, that we consult early and we consult often. I guess that gives rise to some concerns, and for this particular person who's asking the question, they're saying, can we actually ask staff if they're vaccinated? Can we ask staff to advise of their travel arrangements when they're going on leave? And can we request to see COVID negative, test results, COVID test results?
Yep. I think the short answer to that, Amy, is yes, we can ask that information. Whether employees choose to answer or provide that information is another question. But then we need to work out where we are. If we have implemented a mandatory vaccination policy and we are requiring employees to provide information about vaccination status, we can equally require them to provide information about where they are going on leave, so we can properly assess the risks to the business. And that may be equally so if we don't implement a mandatory vaccination policy. So if we ask the information and they refuse to provide it, then we need to be having a conversation with that employee or volunteer as to why do they not want to provide that information? What is the concern for them, and how do we meet or manage that concern while at the same time being able to protect the interests of the business and guard against risks to other employees and service users? Because I think they are reasonable questions in the circumstances. I think it is reasonable to know where an employee is going or a volunteer is going, so we can properly understand the risk of them returning to the workplace, either with or without a quarantine period from when they return. And so we can manage that risk. And it may be that we want to put in place a work from home arrangement for a period of 5 to 7 days, subject to what hotspot, if any, that they've been in. So I certainly think it is reasonable. If the employee or volunteer refuses, I would be explaining to them why we consider that information is reasonable and necessary. And if they continue to refuse, then I think we need to consider disciplinary action. And I know that sounds harsh in the circumstances, but we're not just dealing with the health and safety of one individual. We're dealing with your entire workforce and all of the service users that attend at your premises. So I would first recommend consultation, as you say, Amy, and, you know, having that conversation with them, obviously before we get to a disciplinary sanction, but I certainly think it is reasonable in the circumstances to ask.
Thank you, Christy. I think, you know, something that strikes me that's sort of interesting, but also I think helps to allay some of the confusion and concerns is the similarity between the language you're using and the language of human rights and the language that Tim's using around balancing, thinking about whether what you're asking for is reasonable and necessary, which is also something that you would consider if you're looking at making a human rights respecting decision. Yeah, and also, you know, balancing out the needs and interests of all of the other people around that individual, as opposed to just a narrow focus on the individual. Human rights concerns have been something that our organisations have been really concerned about. And one question here, people are sort of saying, do we have a human right to insist on workers and those who attend or want aid from community service workers to insist on vaccination? Are we not contradicting who we are and what we do? Are we adding to the extremely high anxiety, fear, and worry?
Yeah, I suppose, first of all, in terms of the question, just certainly acknowledge this is a really sensitive decision to for entities, particularly the QCOS sort of entities, to be making a decision to exclude people on the basis of medical reasons or just on ethical decisions that they've made is a really sensitive decision, and it's not one that's made lightly. I think, as boring as it sounds, I think that's why that balancing exercise has to be conducted. As long as you can continue to balance the risks, and as long as you're making a rational, reasonable decision after balancing the risks, and keeping attuned to what the changes are at a particular time, like whether they're under the legislation or under what's happening in society, as long as you keep attuned to those risks, keep evaluating the decision. I think in the circumstances, this is a very unusual situation we're in. It is compatible with your human rights to be making a decision for mandatory vaccinations. It can be, as long as you keep that policy under review. QCOS entities, I think you will be acting in accordance with, in accordance with your charter to hopefully provide a really good social service. So I think it is a difficult thing to be doing, a sensitive decision, but unfortunately that's just the situation we're in.
And I think keep in mind that organisations have a number of choices. So you might decide that not to introduce a compulsory vaccination policy. So that's one choice that you could make based on your risk assessments and your consideration of what's reasonable for both your workers and your service users. You could decide to introduce a compulsory vaccination policy for your workers, your employees and volunteers only, and not your service users. So your service users will still attend. You're providing, to the extent that you can, a safe environment for them to attend, but they may be bringing COVID into your workplace. So you need to have organised steps in place to continue to protect your staff members. And by requiring them to be vaccinated, that may be the measure by which you choose to protect your staff members. Or you could introduce a policy that requires compulsory vaccinations for staff members, including volunteers and service users. All of those three options are legitimate options and to consider, and they should all be weighed up in the scheme of things.
Yes, it is really, I think you know, really neatly there pointed to why this is such a difficult decision for our organisations to make, because I think the idea of excluding service users is something that is very confronting. But as you say, we do need to remove ourselves, and you know, Tim described it as a boring framework for making decisions, but it actually gives, you know, us some safety, doesn't it, to sort of apply just a legal framework to your decision making, so that you're actually thinking about, okay, what are the risks here, and how do we manage those and balance those depending on who's using our services and what the risk to our staff is. I think I'm just going to squeeze in one final question, which is quite specific from a homelessness specialist homelessness provider. So they're saying, you know, it is a specific question: should a specialist homelessness provider with congregate housing mandate staff vaccinations?
Good one. I'm going to leave that one to Nicola.
Thank you. So whether you should mandate the vaccination or not will depend on the risk assessment that you've carried out as an organisation, and that needs to take into consideration all the factors that we've already outlined in the paper. Additionally, given the type of service, we think that you could issue a lawful and reasonable direction to your staff and volunteers to mandate the vaccination for their own safety and also for the safety of their service users.
Thank you very much, Nicola. I think that is all we have time for today. I've just seen, you know, there's so many questions coming in through the chat. We've received lots of questions offline as well. This clearly is a really complex and challenging time for community organisations. I do really recommend that you have a look at the excellent resource that Clayton Utz have provided and that we've put up on our website to help you guide your decision making. But the key takeaway, as I said, is vaccine mandates. Whether to mandate or not probably isn't the first question. The first question all organisations should be asking is what is the risk for our organisation, including for our service users, and then to develop a plan for your organisation based on that risk, and to continue to monitor that risk. And vaccine mandates may be one of the options that you look at, but certainly isn't the only thing to consider when looking at how best to manage the risk of COVID, particularly as that risk increases as borders open. So thank you so much, can I say, to Christy, Tim and Nicola. That was an extremely comprehensive and clear presentation, and we're incredibly grateful to you for your time and for your expertise. And thank you also to everyone who has attended this morning. We had a great level of participation, and this recording, this session will be made available on our website, so you're free to share it with anyone who may have missed this morning. Thanks everyone for your participation, and have a wonderful day.